Thanks, Betsy. How lovely it is to be here in the flesh with all of you. Welcome this morning. I love to see your shining faces, and I just like to speak forth a word of gratitude for those of you who were here yesterday with the rest of us for the Not a Cent or 1 cent event. So the love, the activity of grace was evident in all of us who welcomed and received those who came. The message title for today is actually a bit of a misnomer, and it's just evidence that each one of us is growing spiritually all the time, especially if we present ourselves receptive, yielded, and willing to be grown. The title is, for me, a misnomer in terms of where I have reached my own understanding, as Betsy beautifully introduced us to that quality. There is no right use of spiritual power, in fact. And what a great way for that title, which usually comes through for me a few months ahead, to be reconsidered as I sat in prayer this week. As the message comes through, I hope I succeed in sharing with you how it is that spiritual power is not something to be used. Rather, it is what uses us when we are yielded, willing, and in my case, ready to be at that disposal of spiritual power. The scripture which inspired me this week is a very familiar one, and it comes from Psalm 91, and I would like to share only those parts of the psalm which I can tell you for many years had me bewildered, confused, and even a bit hesitant about what I say this power that is God is that lives in me. So I will read the first 2 verses and then I'll move down to verses 11 through 14. He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. We are given several promises of safety and of security. And here comes the part that for a long time spoke to me of a God of caprice, a God of whim, a God I was not sure I could actually trust. It says, "You will not fear the terror of the night, nor the arrow that flies by day, nor the pestilence," that rings a bell, "that stalks in the darkness, nor the plague that destroys at midday. 1,000 may fall at your side, 10,000 at your right hand, but it will not come near you." And often we recognize from a well-known hymn, "Near you it shall not come." I did not understand how to reconcile a God who played favorites with an omnipotent power for a long time. Some of you are familiar with Course in Miracles, knows that much of its backbone is based on the idea of specialness, that none of us is special in the eyes of God. Each one of us is a spark of the divine flame and connected to our source by the divinity that is our true identity. So what could I do for years and years with the 1,000 that might fall at my left side and the 10,000 at my right? It has taken me a lifetime of seeking understanding of those verses to recognize the truth there is truth that 1,000 continue to fall at my left and 10,000 at my right. And in terms of the material realm, in terms of that happening out here, it has nothing to do with God as power and has everything to do with my consciousness, with where I dwell, with where I live, with where we are told in John 15th chapter to abide in God and let God abide in me. So it's not a God of caprice, allowing 10,000 to perish over here and 1,000 over here, and my being spared because I'm so wonderful or so prayed up or so spiritual. No, it has everything to do with where I abide in consciousness. The idea of spiritual power not being used is an important one. And even in some unity writings, certainly we will find that concept of how do I access it? What am I doing when I'm trying to use spiritual power? And for me, the illumination that has become clearer is that no one can use spiritual power, because spiritual power is that which, when we refrain from attempting to use it, uses us. It moves invisibly through us. It lives in the silence. It abides in the stillness. This became easier for me to understand as I rationalized, well, as long as I was believing that I could use spiritual power, what would I use it for anyway? What was the thinking or even the heart energy around what I would do with spiritual power if I believed I could use it? Very quickly, it became clear that any use that I thought I would make of it was linked to the possessive adjective my. I would use it for my good or my goals or my plans, or perhaps even at the very best, I would seek to use spiritual power for being a sacred witness to another's healing. Whatever story I told myself about using it only served to highlight that if I think I can use it, I am self-deceived. The very connotation of the verb use suggests implementing something, having it over something, or at least to respond to something with. And yet we gather here in Unity and Unity centers all over the world to follow the teachings, the method outlined by Jesus the Christ, who said, I myself can do nothing. So did he mean nothing except use spiritual power? Was that an exception? Did he then use power over others or in reaction to something? No. And so we get to look more closely at all of his invitations to us, because we know in Unity that Jesus did not come to start Christianity. Jesus came to model a higher frequency, a different vibration, a completely new way of showing up in the world. So what did he mean then when he said, the Father within does the work? I do the work of the one who sent me. So for me, I hear very clearly in that instrumentality, being a channel, a vehicle, not using, not even applying, but being available for the power to flow through and from. And enough of us have been immersed in metaphysical healing, and how all spiritual healing happens has nothing to do with the material realm. It has nothing to do with doing. It has everything connected with just being that vehicle, just being that channel. When we make of ourselves instruments, channels, some mystics call it a transparency. As a teacher, that's always interesting for me, because the first image I get is, those transparencies all full of different colored ink. And why not? It works for me. It's just one more way that I clear my consciousness of the possessive adjective, my power, my ability, my using power. When I make of myself an instrument, a channel, or a transparency through which the allness of life, the infinite wisdom of life can flow, then I'm being used by spiritual power. Jesus, we know, was crucified because the perception in the world that he chose to come into to teach, he had to be annihilated, because the perception was that he had made himself equal with God, and that he did have omnipotence of God that allowed him to do what he was able to do. Yet, a closer look at any of the Master's teachings quickly reveal that he never once professed to have as much power as God, or even power over anything in the sense of exerting it physically. I come back to his recurring statement, which was, I'm nothing without God. I can do nothing of myself. And it is only when I, too, following the Master, recognize that of myself I can do nothing, that I can present myself yielded, receptive, and perhaps most importantly, abstaining from thought. When we abstain from thought and become still and feel, certainly we can feel that power that abides in us, then we can have no hesitancy in claiming that the same God power that flowed through Jesus the Christ, and perhaps to a lesser degree in other mystics and masters through the ages, that same power, all of it, the omnipotence, all of it, can also flow through us. Otherwise, it would suggest that God divides power up and uses a bit of it on me and then a bit on you, just a little bit. If we believe, as we say every Sunday, that God is omnipotence, or that God is the only power and all power, then let's take a minute this morning and rethink God power as the indivisible activity in my consciousness. God power is the indivisible activity in my consciousness, of my consciousness, that renders my consciousness holy ground. Not because I, Rosalind, am there. Maybe not even because I've been in that consciousness in many other forms at other times. What makes it holy, what makes my consciousness full of the omnipotence of God, is because I have allowed God to come through me. God in my consciousness, properly received, is my mind, my life, my soul. God is the substance of my very body. Therefore, to be still, to become truly still, devoid of all thought, is to allow the allness of God power to flow through me. My experience is that is when healing happens for myself, or metaphysically presenting myself as a sacred witness through prayer to another who may be forgetting that God power awaits their opening, their aligning to it, not using it. If we know that God is the life of individual persons, that God is the life that is immortal, then God must constitute the mind of each one of us. It is this consciousness that must embrace everything that God is: wisdom, goodness, guidance, intelligence, and yes, we can open to allow spiritual power to flow through us, because if I am presenting myself as God's instrument, I have no right to settle for any less than infinite power. That spiritual power, which is not mine to give, it is not mine to withhold, and it is not mine, above all, to use. If I can just realize that truth, that I do not claim personal possession of spiritual power, and can proclaim and present myself rather as an instrument, as a transparency through which the invisible Father, source, power can flow, is manifesting, then I become that instrument through which it freely expresses. Stop for a moment and think of the impediments or the obstacles or the blockages. I already referenced, magic marker in every color all over that transparency. What are those colors in your life that may be blockages to simply being still enough to allow all power to embrace me? It could be beliefs, attitudes, limitations, values, and attitudes that are Klingons. They have just become barnacles that we haven't totally released. And yet, it is often in those moments of perceived limitation that the temptation can arise to use spiritual power to make it different. And then we become more and more entangled in the different colors, distractions on the transparency, rather than becoming a clear, lucid channel for power to flow. Spiritual power, in my experience, comes into tangible expression in the stillness. How many times have we heard in unity circles, in the stillness is where spirit lives. In the silence, there is a sacred place, a secret hiding place. God is there. All the power of God is there. And the key is to take no thought. Stop for a minute and just close your eyes and notice the absence of thought. That's a thought. As you practice the absence of thought, when we really believe the Master's teaching, or at least he asked a question, like every good teacher does, which one of you believes that you can add even 1 cubit to your life by taking care about tomorrow? And yet that's where the ego takes us, to suffer about what is not yet, or to hurt ourselves about what has already been, as opposed to dwelling in the infinite right now and finding that the power of God moves into that vacuum that I have willingly presented. There can be, folks, no freedom, no healing, no abundance by taking thought about any of those things. For we have that in us, which is so much greater than those things that pull on us, tug on us, I'm going to say, seem real, whether it's an appearance of dis-ease or of lack or of limitation. To be still and to know that I am God doesn't mean that I am all of God. It means that I am willing to rest in the power that can come through me when I stop thinking. In quietness and in confidence will spiritual power manifest. Only in quiet, there's the stillness. In confidence, how many times have we reviewed that the word confidence is made up of 2 words in its derivation, with faith. Confideles, with faith. So when I can be quiet in my mind, and when I can totally trust that I will not be the 1,000 that fall, not because I'm special, but because I have decided to be still and allow what is true power to live through me. And so we return once again to one of our fundamental teachings, which is the belief in meditation. That it is only by going within that we can prevent going without. Without healing, without joy, without peace, without immortality, without fear of the loss of this lifetime, which is a drop in the bucket of eternity. So let's just circle back and remember together that spiritual power is not a power over anything or to be exerted over anybody, least of all my own humanity. This power that we have named spiritual through the millennia has been referred to as the light. The light. Light, as we know, does not destroy darkness. There is no need to exert power over darkness, for the light, when present, has no darkness. There is no darkness that can exist in the presence of light. But it's important to notice that that light, that spiritual power, it's not destroying or overcoming darkness. No one ever saw darkness where there is light. In stillness, when we still our humanity, when we can do that, that light is in evidence within us. And in that presence of that light, of that spiritual power, there is only freedom. There is only peace. There is only immortality. This power, which was new, in this concept of power that I'm about to share, was very new over 100 years ago, and certainly new when the Fillmores practiced it. This power does not heal. It is not that power that exerts pressure to forgive sins or to remove lack. The truth is, when I can abide under the shadow of that power, nothing else is real. Nothing else expresses. Because where that light is, none of these appearances can manifest. And this is where my real spiritual work begins. When I can notice that appearances have no power. When I can truly live from my understanding that the omnipotence of God is the only thing that has power, and that it does not wield that power. It does not impose that power. It simply waits. It waits in the silence. All negative aspects of our human experience, and some of us have certainly had more than others, are not entities that some of us were taught need to be acted upon or worked on. Just the opposite. We will follow the admonition in John 15, which simply says, abide in me, abide in love, abide in God, and there's the key verb, let me abide in you. Abide in what? Well, I love the first line of the Psalm 91, which again was a rather new realization for me when I heard the word shadow. Certainly in Jungian terms, the shadow is not a positive thing. But for the audience of this psalm, the shadow in a desert culture with extreme heat, the shadow was a place of coolness, of rest, of refuge. So when we can abide in a consciousness of this indwelling power and truly succumb to its omnipotence, then we forget dis-ease, disharmony, all manner of limitation and lack. And we bring ourselves into the coolness, the refuge, that shadow of the Almighty. So let's go forth this morning from this very precious time of celebrating life together, recognizing that my entire spiritual journey might be understood in 3 very simple steps. And this is where we come in Unity's tradition to applying what we think we might understand better. And certainly for me this week, this greater appreciation for the notion of power being something not that I use, but that uses me if I allow it, can be summarized in 3 basic steps. As a person on a spiritual journey, my first step is to recognize that this power is really my very own being. It constitutes my consciousness, my life, my soul. How much do I remember it moment by moment? One of the ways that I remind myself is to stay in the next 60 seconds. This morning I spoke with someone who said that he stays in the next second. So that was kind of an invitation for me. That just cut out 59 seconds. That's the first step, to recognize that God is my very own being. What is God? God is omnipotence, omniscience. How much of that do I dwell in consciousness of? The second step, I must know that this is the truth about you as well. Notice how important taking no thought becomes. It is only in thought about another that perception, judgment. The favorite tool of the ego is that it thinks it knows. So we meet someone for the first time and we miss the truth that we are seeing them for the first time because our thinking takes off. So the second necessary step is to know that if I have aligned with this law that is true about me, that all the power of God resides in me, then that's not something that I can make exception for because of someone's personality. No, law does not play favorites, and neither does God. We have that in wisdom text. God is no respecter of persons. So then, the omnipotence, the power that awaits me in the stillness, is the truth of you as well. And finally, the third step is that I must know this about anyone that I have judged as separate from me in any way. In the olden days, we called this the enemies. So we like to think in a couple thousand years that we have evolved. So I call it separation. Certainly there are people on planet Earth right now for whom that word appears to be very real. And we know the truth that to know about ourselves, that we dwell in a consciousness of omnipotence, and to not know it for others, especially those whom we really in our personalities are reluctant to assign it to, will disconnect any ability of the first two steps. So this is the nature of spiritual power as far as I can share with you this morning. That power dwells visibly in minerals, in plants, in animals, in all of nature. And when I bring the presence of that power to conscious realization through meditation, through time spent in the silence, yielding, then I am in a consciousness where the negative side of life is not functioning. It can't. It doesn't. That, in my experience as well, is when the wellspring of joy, which is part of our true identity, can be the only thing that rises. The joy, the peace, the light, and the love of spirit, because I have allowed true power. So though 1,000 may fall at my left and 10,000 may fall at my right, it is probably true that until they are also moving, living, and having their being in the consciousness of God power, of one power, all we can know is that it will not come near our dwelling place. Because when we live consciously in the awareness that God is always present in us and as us, then truly we are dwelling in the secret, sacred place of the Most High. High what? High vibration, high aligning. I must dedicate my life to designated periods of time in the silence. Most of us have done so. Most of us have inserted perhaps hours into our day when we commune with this power by being still and allowing spiritual power to be. And then we truly live from understanding that there can be no other power in the presence of omnipotence. And so let us go away from this talk about spiritual power, understanding a little more about its true nature. The idea being that it's not even power in that normally accepted connotation of that word. It's not a power that does something It's not a power that you use to do something else. In fact, it is a power only that is something. So what a great new way for us to think about spiritual power, that it's merely a power living in isness, waiting for enough silence, enough elimination of thought, enough clearing my transparency, that its light, its immortality, its omnipotence can flow from me. Because if it is all power, what can there possibly be anyway to use it against? It becomes meaningless. Because this power is divine, there is no mortality. In this consciously realized presence of this power, there's no directing it. There's absolutely nothing to do with it or to do it to, because when we are still, spiritual power flows through that stillness. And when you've had that experience, you know that it has nothing to do with using it, applying it, directing it. It simply flows through the silence. And so we know this morning that the battle is not ours. We need not fight anything. We need only see the salvation. What does that mean? The salvation of the Lord. It means the restoration in my consciousness of the notion of wholeness of power. The temporal powers of this world, things like germs, the weather, poisons, they are only power to the three-dimensional mind that still believes in two powers. But if we say that we are living from a consciousness of one power, then we make contact with that power. And when we do in meditation, we are making contact with every single other person on this planet who is also dwelling in that consciousness of oneness with all power. And it is in that moment that every other human being who is doing that can partake of my own joyous light. I become one with that same power that they're choosing to allow to abide in them. And so it is that we function and attract only those who are dwelling in that similar level. This is praying without ceasing. I do not think, I do not need to think, I take no thought, but come into communion with the source of my being by keeping my mind stayed on the divine presence and by relying only on that infinite, invisible, spiritual power that can only flow through me when I am still. So thank you for letting me share with you this morning the true nature of spiritual power and how we can all learn to refrain from using it. So may it be.